on Canvas. I found it on okrangelandswest.okstate.edu. If you Google ecology and management of deer in Oklahoma, it's working. Yeah, that's it.
I really like this guy. And I saw him on the way over here. Didn't acknowledge him. And he texted me. I was like, yeah, bitch, I'm playing those mind games. Did you get my text this morning? I texted you like a half hour ago.
I was in class. I was in the middle of class.
Oh. I forget the people in class before me. That was a lot. I'm tired. It's like t-shirt weather outside. It's hot.
It's not hot.
It's kind of hot.
Okay.
This forestry.
I get hot really easily though.
So I've just been like crossing out sections.
Ow.
What's your email? I can
email those descriptions, but like for us, and then
Good.
look up. I think I put it in the email I sent you, but
I had a
anything about
6'4" guy go up for a layup. I tried to block him and he came right down on my ankle. Slammed my elbow on the court.
I'm doing a
Jammed my hand
project
on the ball.
deal,
Right
so, and I
in
have a bunch of sources and just kind of general stuff. I'll just send you this paper or this like outline kind of deal.
anything in
That's sad, but it's kind of funny.
I'm not good at basketball.
It might not be in that list.
I played when I was little. Like
I really dislike volleyball though. So.
Yeah, here I might not put that one on.
Why you get hit in the face with a ball?
No,
If you read
I
about
just
this,
don't like it.
Oh, sure.
Society cross timbers. This little article.
I am
It
a
tells
mess.
you basically that this is where deer like to
I would love to show you.
I like this. Go on, we do have class today, right? He didn't cancel again.
and then look for regions that meet like all these criteria.
Maybe this means that they'll just make us do the one paper since he's significantly postponing the
This is a satellite image, and I just drew a township around it. This is in Delaware County, but it kind of meets the criteria of the prostate. So then
It's a bunch of like links to articles and stuff.
took a screenshot and they cropped it down.
Oh,
And then
it's yeah.
Oh,
And then, yeah, so that right there, yeah, right about here. Right there is Neosho River.
Must you ruin everything in my
And then
life?
Yucha is like right here in this bottom corner.
It's not texting.
Or on this map,
Snapchat.
anything in this
I'm gonna
kind of
cry,
stupid
Katie. I'm going to
violet,
cry.
and this kind of blue is all, and all this purple, that's all like fair game. That's where they like to stop.
That email. See if it opens up.
Because we keep canceling class, I don't really, like, not getting a chance to ask a lot of questions. I'm just kind of winging it.
Papers you can go to that I've cited.
I think he said 4 or 5 or something.
Who? But he knows he's
See,
attractive.
it's the three options, like one big paper, 3 medium papers.
I've been thinking about it too much. This is my paper so far. I put like a cover, I did like a cover page. But that's all I have. I have a cover page and like 3 paragraphs.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, as long if you get the full thing, now you should add a little bit of context.
1,000 words at 11 font is only like a page and a half, 2 pages. Then just stick maps in it. He was showing us this in class on the day, I think. Yeah, he was showing us, I sent you this. Number.
Yeah, and then those other sources you can go and like throw those into the open for the binders.
On,
Actual cited deals, and you can.
I've been just doing Wikipedia
Yeah.
for those statistics because it's all from the census.
What in the?
Yeah, September 1st to January 15th.
I'm not going for that actual big hole. Look, I got a porcupine fine.
That's
Standing right up.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you again.
Yeah, if you look at that one,
Sorry I'm late. How you folks?
county penetrate,
Uh,
how many deer harvest,
hey,
how many square
We
miles.
have an exam on Friday of next week. Okay? Okay. All right, Friday of next week. We have a place to take the exam now, which is good. So make a note. you will on Friday the 28th, sometime during the day. It can be 11:30 if you'd like. It doesn't have to be. Anywhere between 8 and 12:30. So I'll make the discussion sign up will be on the half hour beginning at 8 o'clock, 8:30, 9, 9:30, until about 12. And then if you'd prefer to take it in the afternoon, I've got the lab from 3 o'clock to 8 o'clock, something like that. So Friday, and it's going to be, what you'll do is just go to room 406. You'll see all this information a little bit later. I'm just going to give you a little bit of heads up. So 28th, Friday, room 406, classroom building. Anybody ever use the labs up on the fourth floor of the classroom building? Breathing, yeah, so you know where those are. And you'll see me there. You don't need to, just show up at the time that you will sign up for, whether that's 8:30 in the morning or 11:30 or 4:30 or something. And I'll be expecting you, okay? You don't need to bring an ID. I know who you are. It's an untimed exam. So how many, raise your hand please if you have so far taken one quiz, at least one quiz. Okay. Hold it really, really high. Now those of you that haven't raised your hand, look around and ask yourself, why haven't I been taking these quizzes? All right. You may not have known they're up there, but they're up there. And we'll maybe take a few today just for kicks, okay? Now, the exam or the quizzes are timed. You have 5 questions on each quiz and 3 minutes to answer those 5 questions, which may seem like a lot, but has anybody ever run out of time once or twice? After a while, it's pretty quick. The exam will not be timed, okay? It's only timed if you show up at noon and it takes you over an hour, but it probably won't take you over an hour. So I guess I could even have a 12:30 session, but you'd have to be done in half an hour. You probably don't want to do that. So, well, we can do that. So the exam is exactly like the quiz, except rather than 5 questions, you have syllabus, 40, 80, something like that. I'll have to look at it. It's worth 80 points. No, it's not 160. Not 160. I wouldn't do that. But it is, I guess, you know, even if it's on the syllabus, I'm not sure. I think I said 80 questions. But if you prefer to have 40, I could do 40. You like 40? 40 is easier than 80? I don't know. Well, anyway, we'll see how that goes. So that you'll show up, and this is the way it works. We do it on Lockdown. We use something called Respondus Lockdown Browser. How many of you have ever used Respondus Lockdown Browser? Okay, good. It's
download something.
You don't have to download anything. You'll just show up at the lab. It'll already be on the desktop of the computer.
Oh, okay.
So you'll just double click on this little icon that looks like a padlock, and it'll open it up, and it's a browser. So you don't want to open up Chrome or Firefox or, you know, whatever. You just want to log in. You'll log into the system with your OKey username and ID. So that's one thing you do need to bring with you is your OKey username and password, okay? And if you need to bring that on your phone like I do every day, that'll work too. Just once you get to the lab and you get logged in, stow your phone if you would, please. So you'll log in with your OKey username and ID. You'll go to the desktop, double click on the padlock on the desktop of the computer. And then it'll ask you to log in again with your OKey username and password. So you do that twice, okay? And it's not that big a deal, but you'll log in once, and then you'll log into the lockdown browser again, and that will take you to Canvas. And then you'll identify geography 3153, you know, picture of a whitetail, a couple whitetails at the feeder. You seen that? Okay. So you'll go to that, you'll double click on that, And then you'll either go to module or quiz, but it's pretty simple. And there will be it'll ask you for an access code, okay? So you'll be able to see the quiz online pretty soon, but you'll have to come to the lab, log in, and enter that access code on site for you to be able to take it, okay? So what is Lockdown Browser? It just keeps you from surfing around and looking for the answer on Wikipedia. But essentially, you're just going to be taking you'll be taking a series of those same sorts of questions, those same questions, in fact. Just a matter of 40 or 80. Or 60, I guess we could do 60 and 1.5 questions. All right. Any questions over that? That process? You know, I found that it's a lot less stress on students, less stress on me. It's paperless, doesn't cost anything. You know, even people who have accommodations over at the UAT, I think find it a little less stressful than even going to the UAT. So, because I don't strip search you like the UAT does. Right?
Metal detectors, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, so that's that. And what's it going to cover? Well, the question is, what's it going to cover? And today, what I'd like to do is talk a bit about, we'll use that thing. We'll talk a little bit about some individuals, some characters in the history of American conservation, the American conservation movement, up to about 1964. So I'm not going to take you beyond really 1964, except when we're talking about the Simon Ehrlich wager. That's a little later. Okay. Somebody tell me about the Simon Ehrlich wager. You ever check into that?
Yeah, it's part of the reading assignment, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So what do you think of it? Julian
I
Simon.
think Simon was on to something.
Yeah, unfortunately, he died of cancer before, you know, and so that kind of shut him up in general. But he's a really interesting character, a real positive, you know, optimist.
How much time did it take? 10 years? Or?
Yeah, they did it over 10 years.
Yeah.
The idea was that, so, you know, Ehrlich said, we're running out of everything. We're running out of everything. Well, if we're running out of everything, the price goes up. Right? If the demand is even if the demand is the same, which we know the demand will be higher, even though because population is growing, and technology is increasing. So the demand for those strategic metals should be increasing. Yet, even as demand is increasing, the supply keeps getting bigger. All right? Petroleum is a great example of that. The price in relative dollars and in real dollars, that is the price adjusted for inflation, the price continues to come down. And so Simon said, you pick, 10 industrial metals or something like that. You pick 10 metals, and in 10 years, or maybe it was 5, and in 10 years, I guarantee you the price adjusted for inflation will be lower in 10 years than it is now. Okay? The more demand there is, the more supply there is.
Or some of them actually lower even than without adjusting for inflation?
Maybe so. Maybe so. Yeah, I'm not real. I haven't read it in a while, but
He knocked it out of the park.
yeah. So
Inflation just
and so you know, Ehrlich actually paid him the wager. He paid him what he owed him. And Simon wanted to do this again. So, but you know, Ehrlich had his own argument against it too. So let's talk a little bit about let me log into this thing and then we'll see what some other personalities. But while I'm doing that, why don't we just go ahead and do some discussion. Anybody check that lecture out? The one lecture that I got linked for you? Okay, that's good. Well, we got a whole 10 days before the exam. What the heck? No biggie. It's yeah, anyway, it works. It works. Works pretty well. And the sound's not the greatest, but it's good.
Could you talk about the paper real quick?
Yeah, sure. What do you want to talk about?
You said you were gonna extend it.
Yeah, until, what was the new deadline?
I don't know, you didn't give it. You just said significantly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
March, was it March 6th,
Okay.
I believe? Is that a Friday? March 6th.
For the whitetail deer paper? Okay, so it's not due Friday.
Yeah, it's not due Friday. Is it March 6th?
The 8th is a Friday.
That's what you just said.
The 6th is a Wednesday.
I had no idea.
It made your week a whole lot easier? Oh, well, I'm glad to hear that.
March
done.
6th.
Dude, March 6th?
Yeah.
Oh, wait. I was looking at it.
I was getting ready to, I was gonna take it to the
Well,
ready.
we'll make it March 6th. It shall be March 6th, okay?
I'm gonna finish it today.
March 6th. Is that a Friday?
Nice.
Yeah.
March 6th. March 6th. All right. I also want you all to do how many of you would enjoy doing like a video project? No. No.
In place of the paper?
No.
Oh.
No, as another project. You don't like doing the video stuff?
I like videos more than papers.
No, I hate it.
Takes more work. If everybody disagrees that they don't want it, and disagrees with me that you want to do a video project, then we most certainly will do a video project.
How long does the video have to be?
Nah, not very long. I'll give you an example. It'll be fun, okay?
It's short though, then you have to write.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I don't have to read, so,
That'd be a lot more entertaining.
Can
than
we
reading.
just like go to a field and pretend to be whitetails and like just talk over the video instead of I'm really dreading this
Wait, you want us to shoot
paper.
like a YouTube video or something?
Yeah, except you won't be putting it on YouTube, you'll be putting it on Flipgrid. Sinner knows what I'm talking about.
You have to take it out.
Yeah.
How many of you ever use Flipgrid?
Never.
Flipgrid?
Yeah, that's what I
Oh,
was
you'll
saying.
like it. It's fun, it's easy, you can do it on your phone.
Shit about
It
it.
doesn't cost you anything.
And like, are we supposed to adjust the habitat? Are we supposed to adjust behavior? Or are we just
Yeah, go ahead and ask your question. Kenzie?
Kelsey?
Kelsey. Sorry.
You're close.
All right. Kelsey, what was your question?
You answered it.
Oh.
It was about the paper.
That's all?
I have a question about the paper.
Yeah.
How much, or how do you want us to cite it? And all the maps and stuff we're, gonna put on it and graphs and, because.
Consistently. I'll say that. I don't care what style you use. Is that what you're asking? Like MLA, APA, Chicago?
Say I have no knowledge of a whitetail deer's habitat and I'm writing, page about it. I'm gonna have to cite a lot of it because I don't,
That's good going. I'm glad you would want to cite things. In terms of the citation for the paper, I think in the rubric, didn't I say something like,
Is there a rubric?
I don't remember seeing anything on it, but I haven't
you
looked.
just need to, just make sure that you cover your bases. I'm not gonna, play, how close did they plagiarize? That sort of thing. I do want you to cite your sources, and, if there's a major mistake, what I'll probably do is send it back to you and say, fix this before we grade it.
Okay.
So, but some of you are doing this as a group project. Who is that? Okay, you guys, and there's another group too. Who was it? Just you guys?
Is Hunter's Toolbox a good source for your data?
ODWC would be the.
Oh, yeah, I think so, yeah.
Hunter's
I
Toolbox?
think so. On the, is that on the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation?
You get their data from.
Okay. Okay, yeah, sounds good. Hey, yeah, that's the point of this. The point of this is to discover, right? And to discover what's out there and how people go about doing things. You're gonna learn, hopefully you're gonna learn more from each other than you're gonna learn from me on doing a project, okay? You'll learn, as a group, you'll definitely learn a lot. seeing how, because some of y'all have different expertise, right? And you're coming from different areas. Maybe it's NREM, maybe it's zoology, maybe it's geography, and maybe it's social science like psychology or sociology. So, all of you are going to have different knowledge levels and different knowledge about different data that are out there. So some of you are hunters, and you have been thinking about white-tailed deer for a lot of your life, and others are not hunters, not at all familiar with the species, but that's fine. That's okay. All right, you'll learn more that way. And oftentimes, it's the naive, the person who does not have the basic knowledge who will ask the best questions, because they're not afraid to ask a question that other people would say, oh, that's a stupid question, right? But there are no stupid questions. Naive questions are fantastic, all right? And you can really only get that when you have people like, that are new to the subject. So anyway, so the paper is due March 6th. That's the great news, I guess. But you can do this, and someday I'll get logged in here. Now, if you were going to describe the history of the American conservation movement to your grandmother, one of those elevator talks or whatever they call it, what would you say? Or if Grandma said, "Oh, when did this conservation stuff get started?" What would you tell her?
Never did. We suck as a human race.
How did it all get going?
In America.
Wasn't it the wealthy elite that started making the push to preserve the wild?
Yeah, I think you could say the elite, it was an elitist thing. So why? Let's go back to Europe. And in Europe, and back in the Middle Ages, who are some people from, say, medieval England that you can recall that were involved with hunting or poaching? Robin Hood. Yeah, Robin Hood. Robin Hood was a poacher, okay? But what did he do? He robbed from the rich to give to the poor, and we were taught that was a good thing to do. But he was a thief, okay? And so, but he was the story, as I understand it, developed, and somebody help me out if you're an English major or something. He was hunting in Sherwood Forest, right? Now, Sherwood Forest, what does that sound like? Oh, do we have names of forests all the time? Not really. Sherwood Forest was an area that was reserved for the aristocracy or for the nobility to hunt. And this was frequently the case in medieval Europe or medieval England, that land controlled by the king was reserved for the nobility for hunting. Hunting was only done by the upper classes. It was an upper class sport and an upper class activity. Still is in England. Still, fox hunting is still very much an upper class activity. So it was very much a class-oriented thing. And then, one of the big changes that took place is that when Englishmen and others, Germans, others arrived in America as immigrants back in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, or 17th, 18th, 19th century, is they suddenly were exposed to hunting as a way of life for subsistence. In other words, you had to survive out in the boondocks. And that was completely new to them. And it was totally turned upside down. Instead of the elite who lived in the cities, it was the everybody, the everyman who was out there, living off the land and hunting and fishing. Only later, after the Industrial Revolution, do we see a rise of sort of an elitist, an upper middle class idea of about hunting and fishing, and that really only comes with capitalism, with the commercialization and the commodification of the materials that people could sell you, to hunt and fish. Up until that time, generally people had their own, may have had their rifle or something, but there was an evolution in the United States from, the lower classes to the upper classes as hunters. And in Europe, it had always been an elitist thing. So people were, depending on who they weren't allowed into places like Sherwood Forests. You were a poacher if you were there without permission, right? So someday I'll get logged in and we'll talk a little bit. Who are some more people who were influential, and who are some people who were influential in the rise of conservation in the United States in the 19th century that we've discussed? Anybody? You say it really loudly if you could, please. I have poor hearing.
It's Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt, okay. We've talked about him. Anybody else?
Stephen Mather.
What is Stephen Mather's role?
He was the founder of the National Park Service. He did a lot to spread the idea of conservation to the local elites. Hosted huge dinners in Mariposa Grove and Yosemite Valley. And even Teddy Roosevelt, he hosted Teddy Roosevelt in one of his excursions. Cooks, the whole nine, 5-star dining, all that kind of stuff, but in the most beautiful spots in the U.S.
Yeah, and who else did that? There were other people who did the very same thing. Good example. You didn't even get that from the readings.
No.
John Muir. You ever heard of John Muir?
Yeah, absolutely.
John Muir followed that very same approach.
Yeah. Roosevelt didn't like the fact he didn't know his bird songs.
They didn't know what?
His bird songs.
Roosevelt's bird songs?
Yeah, Roosevelt was annoyed by the fact that John Muir, as much of an outdoorsman as he was, did not know his bird songs.
Oh, he couldn't identify birds by their song. I got you. Okay. All right. Well, maybe he was hard of hearing like me. So, who was John Muir? Anybody?
Pedestrian, by his own word.
He was
Pedestrian?
forestry. He did stuff with forestry and national parks.
Yeah, he wasn't a forester, but he was very much a preservation-minded man. And today, the environmental people who consider themselves environmentalists usually refer back to John Muir for a lot of the earliest ideas. Now, where was John Muir from? Where did he go? Where did he end up? What did he do? Who was he? Where did he come from?
He was a writer. From Ireland, right?
Scotland.
Scotland.
Good. So he was a Scot. He was a Scot, and he immigrated pretty early on. Anybody? Where did he arrive and all that? Where did he grow up and go to college? He didn't really. He came to the United States and wound up in what state?
California.
On a farm. Lived on a farm before he went to California.
It says
I can't remember.
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin. Good. You guys read it, actually. All right. So he wound up in Wisconsin. He raised on a farm. What was his experience like in Wisconsin? Wisconsin. Yeah, always called Wisconsin. Was he a cheesemaker? Worked on a farm, though, right? And then he decided, like a lot of young men his age in the Middle West, in the 19th century, that he would go west. Why did he go west? Hmm?
Huh?
What? You just guessing?
Yeah.
Don't guess. If you haven't read it.
Is this lesson 3?
I can't remember.
It's reading.
No, we're just talking about John Muir. All right, so John Muir, he's growing up, he's coming of age when the United States is beginning to industrialize. And he winds up going west, going to California, and I like to describe him as sort of one of the really kind of the first hippies. You know, when I was younger, we called hippies. These were people who got, or beatniks back in the 50s, beatniks, and then in the 60s, they, you know, sort of the flower children, hippies, back to nature kind of thing. And, you know, maybe living off the land, or at least not being so materialistic, and not taking a bath all the time, you know, not worrying about stuff like this. And this is the way John Muir's approach to things was. He was very philosophical, right? Was he religious? Those of you who've read a little bit, was he religious? Well, if he's from Scotland, what was he, Presbyterian or something?
Catholic.
All right. So anyway, he's raised pretty much in the Middle West in Wisconsin, and then he winds up kind of hitchhiking to California, like hippies do, right? And he worked a lot of odd jobs. And he did a lot of cool stuff, a lot of interesting jobs. He didn't really last very long at the same job, so he got a lot of experience doing certain things. But he fell in love with one place in particular that later became a national park. Now, it wasn't the first national park.
Yosemite.
Yosemite, yeah. He went to the Yosemite Valley. And in fact, Yosemite Valley was actually being used for agriculture, and the highlands, the high country around Yosemite was a sheep herder's country. And in fact, you might recall from your reading, because I know you've read it, okay? And what did he do he's from Scotland, so he has a little experience with sheep. He works as a sheep shearer, okay? And maybe works as a sheep herder, I'm not sure. But he did some of these things and realized that there was a real problem. Sheep have a tendency to overgraze, and very different, they crop the grass a lot closer than cattle. And when sheep overgraze, what happens to the land? It erodes. And if you're raising sheep up in the high country above Yosemite Valley, what's that going to do to the quality of the water down in the Yosemite Valley?
Mark it up.
Yeah, it's going to muck it up. So he recognized, just from observation, that the agricultural activities, even grazing sheep, was having a detrimental effect on the quality of the water, and of course, what was also going on at this time? Well, he was experiencing, the giant sequoias, redwoods, being harvested for the first time, and of course there were two approaches. One is that these redwood trees are fantastic. They're huge, and with rail cars we could move these massive logs to sawmills and produce all sorts of lumber out of, you could build several houses out of a single tree. And that's pretty amazing. And so there's money to be made there, and there's, potential wealth. So cutting down those trees is going to bring some people wealth. And Muir, of course, Muir didn't have that same thought, at least after a while, or at least that attitude. He began to interpret and believe that there was something more to life and making money. Now, I know some of y'all probably don't believe that, but it's true, all right? There's a lot more to life than just making money. And what Muir saw was that, this is, the sequoias, the giant sequoias are so incredibly unique and so masterful and so old that it just doesn't seem right to utilize them as a resource like you could use Douglas fir, okay, or yellow pine or something like that. So, so he began a movement, and Muir founded an organization that was one of the very first environmental organizations. It's actually a conservation organization, but it's become more of an environmentalist organization. What's the name of that club? The Sierra Club, yeah, Sierra Club. So named after the Sierra Nevada, the mountains where Yosemite. So Muir moves to California. He becomes a popular writer. Becomes a kind of a well-known celebrity, kind of a celebrity writer. Real characteristic, very, very charismatic. But Muir would do tours through Yosemite. And this is how he began to become he started this, the Sierra Club is kind of a grassroots organization of people who were concerned about the future of the forests. And so this is the way that John Muir was able to, he was strategic about communicating his ideas to people. He made sure that the wealthy and powerful, politically powerful, were on his side. Right? He encouraged them to visit, and he took them on tours. Teddy Roosevelt is probably the most famous visit. Was a 3-day tour, wasn't it, through Yosemite? That was Teddy Roosevelt when he was president.
Yeah.
Okay, he was actually president. Takes a tour with John Muir through the woods. The Secret Service guys are running around, talking on their phones.
Secret Service wasn't around back then.
They were around, but they didn't have those. But anyway, they actually went along. I think journalists probably went along,
Yes.
and so they publicized all this. So it became big, big story. It's a big PR move by John Muir. So John Muir is able to convince the elites. Just like, it's still going on in California today, right? Any particular cause, if they can get the celebrities behind it, oh man, they're in good shape, right? You get the celebrities telling everybody what to do, then it can often work. So, but Teddy Roosevelt, and Roosevelt had, of course, lots of friends in high places, right? So, who are some other individuals that you would associate with John Muir, or actually associate more with Teddy Roosevelt? Now, I can only do one thing at a time. I can do about half a thing at a time, actually. All right, so let's see. Lessons. Go to these. If you go to the module, you'll see these lessons. And we've talked about population, I think, maybe enough. Conservation movement to 1914. That's kind of where we are. We're on lesson 3, just like you said. If you click on that, you open that link, you'll go to what's called a page, and you've got some reading. So it's not a lot of reading, but be sure to do this. This is out of the textbook by Wright. This is the old, sort of the history of the development of conservation. And then Gary Klee, that's a newer book from the 1990s, History of American Natural Resource Management. It's a little overkill, but here are some study questions. After you read this stuff, read these study questions, and then most of these study questions will have corollaries in the quiz, in the practice quiz. So who is considered the father of landscape architecture and how does he relate to the subject of conservation? Now, see, this is just directing right back to some of this reading. Who's the father of land? Some of you are landscape architecture majors, right? Maybe not in this class. Sort of, you thinking about it?
Architecture.
Huh?
Architecture.
Architecture, okay. Landscape architecture? That's right, yeah. So who's the father of landscape architecture?
We've been over it like 8 times.
Okay, who's the guy that designed Central Park? What? Was it Frank Lloyd Wright?
Yeah.
No.
Frank Lloyd Wright.
Huh?
Who did the crazy wacky buildings?
Oh. I'm good at this.
Okay, well, who's the father of the American conservation movement? And why him? Well, okay, that's, you're gonna have to look at some of these things. So I've got a little timeline here. And everybody who's linked on this timeline, most everybody who's linked on this timeline is gonna be, this is my own timeline, by the way, and it can continue to grow. If you see something that's missing here, let me know and I'll add it. But we're talking about the 1880s, 1890s when this is happening. John Muir founds the Sierra Club. Can you even see that?
No.
No, sorry about that. If you want to follow along, I'm in lesson 3. See that now? Okay, so here's my timeline. I like timelines for some reason. Okay, so Roosevelt, let's go back to Roosevelt a little bit. Roosevelt, you know, is macho man. He's wealthy enough to play around and, you know, not have to really work very hard. So he goes out and decides he wants to be a rancher out in the Dakotas, out in Dakota Territory, right? So he does that, and he writes a lot of stuff and becomes pretty popular for his writings. He's actually a really good writer. And then he and George Bird Grinnell found the Boone and Crockett Club, which is established in 1887. The Boone and Crockett Club, you deer hunters know as the sort of the way that you score, right? The way that you score a deer or an elk or, you know, a muley, based on measurements of the antlers, right? Pretty much. Yes. So you have it's kind of a way to quantify, you know, your hunting and to, you know, compare yourself to other people, I guess. But it started out, and I've talked about this before. It was a privately funded organization, and it was really founded to promote and support the conservation of game, animals, and the restoration of wildlife habitat. That's the most important thing that they did. They began to try to protect habitat that all sorts of game animals needed, particularly in the West, in the United States West, because they felt that that commercialization, that industrial development was going to threaten habitat for the game animals. So to protect the game animals from the commoners, all right, they were able to start these clubs, and these were very influential. Also included another very influential guy by the name of Aldo Leopold. How many of you heard of Aldo Leopold? Okay, good. Where have you heard from Aldo Leopold?
I watch Meat Eater and Stephen Rinella all the time.
What?
You ever watch the TV show Meat Eater with Stephen Rinella?
Meat Eater? Meat Eater. I've heard of it.
I'm like all the time.
Really?
Yeah, he like read his book and stuff.
Okay, Aldo Leopold. So what's Aldo Leopold's famous book? Most famous book? He's got several. The Sand County Almanac, right? The Sand County Almanac was it's a collection of writings, and Aldo Leopold was a really unique guy. He was skilled in many things. He was the first head of a department of wildlife management okay, at the University of Wisconsin. They created the department for him. And so he established the whole field of wildlife management, or game management, actually, is what they call it, I believe. Game management. And that's one of his books, Game Management, one of his more influential books. A Sand County Almanac is kind of a literary, poetic, philosophical set of writings, and it's about Sand County, Wisconsin, right? No. Where did he live? He was from Iowa, but he lived in Wisconsin, okay? So anyway, Aldo Leopold, when he was fairly old, his gut kind of started, I guess, a little bit late in life with his family, but he had this old farm. There was this old ruined farm that he spent a lot of his life rehabilitating. Okay, so it was an old, worn-out farm, and he worked at getting the soils to be regenerated, to rehabilitate the soils by planting different crops, by all sorts of different means. And he recorded what he did, and but he became a very sort of prominent academic in terms of wildlife management and conservation in general. His writings were very influential on a lot of people later on. And he was the type of individual who was an avid hunter and fisherman. Yet he's also one of the most recognized for protecting habitat and disseminating ideas about game management to the states. Okay. Now, when it comes to wildlife as a natural resource, states usually have the purview over regulating natural resources that are mobile, like wildlife or water, okay? And so he was influential in establishing state regulations and management practices for those states. But anyway, so that's, the hunters are the ones who really start doing things in the 1870s, 1880s as the United States is industrializing. But I'm going to jump over here to the Sierra Club. And 1892 is when Muir founds the Sierra Club. And again, this was mostly about protecting Yosemite Valley. And eventually what happens is he influences Roosevelt enough that Roosevelt begins to use his influence and his presidential power to protect public lands. And I told you, Roosevelt's a Republican, but he's very different than most Republicans in the sense that he moved a lot of land into federal protection, rather than presuming that the free market knows all well and knows the free market will bring us conservation. He used his bully pulpit to protect lands from access by industrialists and by the general public. Actually, to save them for the general public. So John Muir, and you can read some of the in the readings you'll read about John Muir. So if you look at we'll go to one of these. Like if you go to Gary Clee's chapter, I'll open that in a new link. It'll download as a PDF. I'll open it as a PDF, and hopefully it'll open. So it's failed disk full. All right. Well, anyway, if you read that, you'll see sections on John Muir. You'll see sections on Aldo Leopold. You'll see sections on other folks. One of the last ones you'll read about would be the marine biologist that got DDT banned.
Rachel Carson.
Rachel Carson, great. So there are a lot of influential folks. Now, I'm going to tell you why I kind of stop these, this period at about 1914. And I probably should have gone, maybe stopped at about 1910. But Roosevelt's influence is there prior to World War I. But after World War I, during World War I, the United States industrial expansion is, full throttle. It is wide open, and a lot of the protections that these progressive Republicans or these liberal Republicans put into place in the progressive era, during the progressive era, they weren't ignored and they weren't eliminated, but they were overshadowed by the growth of the economy during the war. The United States economy grew like crazy during World War I. And then, of course, we went into the Great Depression. So the next unit, the lesson 4, takes up with the Great Depression. That's another story. And I've talked about sort of the pendulum of conservation, environmentalism, swinging back and forth. So we have industrialization of the United States, during or after the Civil War, brings about sort of a movement by the elite to establish conservation methods, and this is all very academic. And then we get sort of the progressive era, lots of reforms, lots of regulations, and lots of lands protected by the federal government. Then we have World War I. Industrial expansion takes off, and there's a lot of things that are changing. And then the stock market crashes, the Federal Reserve doesn't do its job, and the economy tanks. That middle one's kind of my own opinion there. But anyway, the economy tanks, we get to the Great Depression. And then you have big government arriving to the rescue. And the New Deal during Franklin Roosevelt's tenure during the 1930s was one in which, whether or not it was, a way to recover, way to keep the economy from, whether or not it was actually useful is debatable, okay? Whether or not it was actually a way to get the economy moving is debatable. It doesn't really matter because World War II recovered the economy in about 1938, 39. But up until then, things were pretty drastic. There were a lot of problems going on in the world, a lot of problems going on in the United States economy during the 1920s and the 1930s. So I want you to know that. The 1930s is when we usually think of the Great Depression, but the United States agriculturally had already entered a depression in the 1920s. Because after World War I was over and Europeans started feeding themselves, commodity prices, which were actually supported by the government artificially, were relaxed. And so commodity prices fell throughout the 1920s. Holy cow, sorry about that. It's 20 after. All right. Well, anyway, you can read more about this stuff. Please do online. The Great Depression started in farm country in about 1920. And in the 1930s is when we begin to see some relief, at least from the government standpoint. And I'm just talking as you walk out, so don't let me hold you. But do some reading and try those quizzes out if you haven't.